In this Bloomburrow limited set review, I will be analyzing and evaluating the cards from Bloomburrow to help you prepare for your events. I will not be discussing every card in the set. Instead, I will evaluate a sizable number of cards to help you learn how to approach the set yourself, which will be a better use of everyone's time and also much more helpful in the long run. We'll kick things off with a gold uncommon. We'll go through the gold uncommons for all 10 color pairs so that we can understand the context of the set and how you should be looking at the cards in the lens of the archetypes or the strategies that you will be playing. So first up is Seedglaive Mentor, which is 3 mana for a 3/2 with Vigilance and Haste, and it has the Valiant ability, which means whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, it gets an extra effect, in this case a +1/+1 counter. This is a really nice card for the red-white mouse deck, because if you play this on turn 3 and just start growing it over the course of the game, it becomes a formidable threat that hits really hard. Now there are some downsides to this card. Having only 2 toughness means that when you play this on turn 3, most creatures your opponent have in play are going to be able to trade with this card, which means it will kind of have to sit around and maybe not benefit fully from the haste if your opponent does have a blocker in play, unless you have like a way to immediately target it in like the mid to late game. But on turn 3, it's oftentimes going to be stymied, which puts you in a bit of a pickle because you don't necessarily want to attack in and trade this card off if it has the potential to grow down the line. That being said, still a really nice card. In the draft portion, I wouldn't necessarily take this too highly because it is very committal. That's one of the things about all of these gold cards, these multicolored cards. Gold is another term for multicolored card, is that they're very committal because they require you to be 2 colors to play them. They can't just fit into any red deck or any white deck. That has to be specifically red-white. And so as a result of this, I think I would take this card fairly highly. I'd be pretty happy to play it once I was in red-white, and it's like one of the best cards you can have for that deck. But early in the draft, I'd probably still prioritize just taking really strong monocolored commons and uncommons over it, which is kind of a theme with a lot of these cards. Next up is Tidecaller Mentor, which is 3 mana for a 3/3 menace, so already really solid stats. It's important not to get too bogged down in the abilities sometimes. This card just already has really good stat lines, although it does lean a little bit more aggressive, whereas blue-black sometimes wants to be more of a controlling deck. So keep that in mind as well. If the card has really good stats for a certain type of deck, but not necessarily for the deck that you're playing it in, that's something that to be noted. So if this card was like 3 mana 3/4 and didn't have menace, that would probably be much better for a blue-black deck because blue-black cares much more about defending and blocking and trading off the cards, especially with the threshold mechanic, which is the second part of this card. When it enters, if 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, you return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So it's kind of interesting because this card fundamentally as a 3 mana 3/3 menace is a more aggressive card, but it also has this threshold ability, which in the late game lets it play as more of a tempo card, which only really happens in the late game, but it does make it a really good card to help finish off your opponent if you are trying to play a tempo threshold game. Tempo and threshold don't necessarily pull in the same directions because trying to fill your graveyard is a bit of an endeavor. It does happen naturally eventually, but usually you want to put a little bit of effort into it by like having cards that fill your graveyard, by like drawing you and discarding cards to help you put cards directly into your graveyard. So I think this card is definitely quite good. But again, it's not a card that I would take over a strong monocolored card early because, again, I want to prioritize that flexibility in the draft portion. But once you're in blue-black, this is quite good, as long as you're leaning towards aggression. Like, the bouncing of things is really nice, especially keep in mind that you can bounce your own creatures or your own permanents if, for example, they have a good enters the battlefield effect. Those are the sorts of things to keep in mind with this card. It's very flexible, pretty strong in the late game. And on turn 3, it's also just a card that you can be happy to play. But make sure that if you are playing this card, and you're trying to maximize it, that you maybe have some tempo elements or some ways to maybe push a little bit of damage. Next is Burrowguard Mentor, a very straightforward card. It's 2 mana for a star. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. Importantly, it does count itself, so you can just run this out on turn 2, and it has trample. So this is the sort of card, again, I'm not going to take this one early, but it is quite nice if you do have a lot of cards that like work well with it, cards that make multiple bodies for one card. If you get like a 2 mana 4/4 out of this in the mid game, you're going to be quite happy, and I feel like that's not going to be that hard to do. So this is the sort of card, once you're in green-white, you're very happy to pick it up, and this is one I think is maybe a little bit better than some of the other cards, just because 2-drops are really high priority. So 2-drops are like much better than 3-drops a lot of the time, because you kind of end up with 3-drop soup in a lot of decks where you just have plenty of 3-drops to choose from, plenty of 4-drops to choose from, but a really good 2-drop for your deck is a high priority. So I think I would take this card quite highly once I even just had a couple of green cards or white cards, because it could like be a nice pull into your green-white deck. Next is Stormcatch Mentor. Again, keep in mind, this is a 2-drop, really nice for the sorts of decks that want it. 2 mana, 1/1 haste, so it doesn't necessarily attack that great on turn 1, but you can maybe play it in the mid game, get some nice damage, chip damage in, and it has prowess, so it can grow over time when you cast non-creature spells, and instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So blue-red is a deck that cares about spells, so making all of those instants and sorceries cheaper is really, really nice, and this is just a perfect card to play on turn 2, help set up your strategy. Again, having a really good 2-drop for your deck is really nice, because again, it just gets the ball rolling a bit earlier, and there's more competition at the higher mana slots because there's more good things to do the higher up the curve you get. So having really good 2-drops is excellent. This card seems really good to me, and definitely a high priority in blue-red, and definitely a card that can pull you into blue-red as well, similar to the green-white rabbit we just looked at. Next is a Vinery Mentor, another 2-drop. This card, very straightforward. When it enters or dies, you get a food token, and it's just a 2-mana 3/2. So right off the bat, the stat line's amazing. It also really gets the ball rolling early with food, and unlike the 3/2 we looked at earlier in red-white, this one doesn't really mind trading off. So when it dies, you get another food token. One of the mechanics in green-black pretty heavily is the forage mechanic, which we will get to some cards that have that mechanic, but basically it lets you get extra value by sacrificing a food or by exiling 3 cards from your graveyard. So this card coming into play, immediately making a food, and then dying and immediately making a food is like pretty nice. Your opponent's going to want to trade with it early because it's a 3/2. So if they block it with a 2/2, they get a little bit of a like power toughness exchange value in their favor. But giving you 2 foods for 1 card is going to be really, really nice for enabling forage cards, and it's going to really power up your deck. So this card looks excellent to me. I think it's probably the best of the cards we've looked at so far. Just as far as a like really early enabler that just really puts your opponent under a lot of pressure. It's also worth noting that you're going to have games where your opponent just like stumbles a little bit, they don't hit a 2-drop, and all of a sudden your 2-mana 3/2 just hits them for like 9 before they get like anything going. And like if you just go this card into like a reasonable 3-drop into a reasonable 4-drop and your opponent doesn't play anything until turn 3, you're just going to be really, really far ahead. And so 2-mana 3/2s just really punish your opponent. This card is definitely excellent, and a card that I think I would take really early and try to move into green-black as a result. It's just that good for what you're trying to do in that deck. Next is Plume-Creed Mentor. Blue-white is a deck that cares about flyers, but also cares about cards that don't have flying because your flyers often like interact with your ground creatures in some way, buffing them up. So Plume-Creed Mentor, or another creature with flying enters, you put a counter on target creature you control without flying. So you're going to want to have that delicate balancing act. Usually that's not going to be that hard because there are going to be lots of creatures that don't have flying naturally, but you are going to want to have a lot of flyers in your deck and a lot of non-flyers in your deck, and generally that just means prioritizing flyers because you're going to end up with ground creatures no matter what you do, pretty much always. But a 3-mana 2/3 flyer is just really good stats already, and once you factor in the ability to like put a counter on as soon as this creature itself comes into play, and other creatures with flying, this card is just really, really good. Just imagine going a 2-mana 2/2 and then just playing this on turn 3. All of a sudden you have a 3/3, which can just outstat almost every other 2-drop. You're hitting your opponent for 3, and you just immediately are off to the races because now you play another flyer, and your creature that you had that was a 3/3 is all of a sudden a 4/4, and now it can tangle with your opponent's 3-drops and 4-drops and really put your opponent under a lot of pressure. So I think Plume-Creed Mentor is fantastic. Really a nice reason to be in this kind of birds flying deck, and I think it's a really early pick as a result. This card looks fantastic to me. Next is Wandertail Mentor. This is a red-green card. Again, we've talked about the importance of really good 2-drops, and this one is fantastic for what you're trying to do in red-green, which is cast, or actually not cast 4-drops, but spend 4 mana on spells during a turn. This is a new mechanic, the expend mechanic. One thing I do want to note about it, it's not spending 5 mana, it's spending mana to cast spells. So don't think that if you're activating abilities, it will count for expend. That's just a warning that I want to issue before you get like caught in a trap like that. But Wandertail Mentor is fantastic because it's a 2-drop that immediately lets you start casting your 4-drops and really accelerates you, all while being a growing threat on its own, because when you expend 4, you put a counter on the Mentor. So this is just what you want out of your mana dorks. They really accelerate you early, and then they become brawlers that absolutely attack your opponent really, really well in the mid game. So Wandertail Mentor looks fantastic to me, exactly what red-green wants to do, and just a card that I definitely think you should be taking highly. It looks fantastic. Starseer Mentor is a bit more expensive, so 5 mana, so that really does come with a lot of responsibility. There are a lot of really good cards to play towards this later stage of the game. So 5 mana for a 3/5 flyer with vigilance. So immediately, always the first thing you should be doing is thinking about the stats and whether the ability really needs to carry the card or whether the card is solid even without the ability. So that's just a thing to like think about. Like, okay, 5 mana 3/5 vigilance, would I be happy with that? You're probably a little bit like you're probably fine with that. That's actually a pretty reasonable stat line. Vigilance on a flyer is nice because flyers can almost always attack unopposed, especially when it's a big flyer. Like a 3/5 flyer is absolutely huge, and that means that this card's going to be able to connect a lot of the time. So 5 mana 3/5 flyer, already with vigilance, already pretty good. And the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life, so that's important, there are cards that you can play yourself that will cause you to lose life. That's worth knowing. And there are cards that you can play, of course, that will help you gain life as well. Target opponent loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. So that means that if you have the ability to like gain or lose life, you can hit your opponent for like 6 a turn with this card, which is quite significant. I think this card's really, really good if you have the ability to set it up. If you're just playing a 5 mana 3/5 vigilance flyer, that's also pretty solid. And as a result, I think this card's really nice. It's also the first card that we've looked at here that's actually like somewhat splashable, which is something to keep in mind. Like if you're playing like a deck that has a little bit of life gain in it, but maybe isn't fully like white-black, maybe you're playing like a white deck, like a white-blue flyers deck or something like that, you can definitely sort of maybe slot this card in, though it does really want to get the ability enabled, and so you probably like are going to be happiest playing this in black-white. But just keep that in mind. With these like single-pipped expensive cards, they are sometimes splashable if they like fit your deck's strategy really, really well. But yeah, I think this card's going to be a nice performer. But again, 5-drops aren't the biggest priority usually, especially 5 mana gold cards, because they're just a little bit inflexible and a little bit expensive, and so you have a lot of competition the higher up the curve you go. So make sure that you're this is like a great card once you're in white black, but maybe not the highest priority early in the draft to pick. But once you're in white black, definitely a good card. And then next is Lily Splash Mentor, which is a 4-drop, so like 4 mana 4/4, really rock solid stats. It has reach, so a little bit of defensiveness, but not really the best like ability over there. But for 3 mana, you can exile another creature and then return to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, which at sorcery speed. So you can't use it to protect your creatures from removal spells or things like that, but you can re-trigger good entries of the battlefield effects, which is definitely something that's worthwhile, and you can slowly grow your creatures over time. Now, I think this card is really solid in blue-green, but not really as high of a pick as some of the other cards we've seen. It's like a 4 mana 4/4. It's just not like crazy good stat lines these days for your like gold cards when they're inflexible. Once you're in blue-green, you're going to be happy to play this. But early in the draft, it's not like this card is like a tremendously like crazy good pull. I think generally the better your entrance to battlefield effects, and once you're in blue-green, the more happy you are going to be to take this card early. But 4-drop with like solid stats, it's definitely a good card. Don't get me wrong, but it's not maybe as good as some of the other multicolored cards we've been looking at. And then the final multicolored gold card is a Fireglass Mentor. It's 2 mana for a 2/1, so not great stats, but it is an aggressive stat line because it just comes down early. Just not really good. Like we've seen a 2 mana 3/2 and things like that, so nothing crazy there. But at the beginning of your second main phase, if an opponent lost life this turn, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, you choose one of them, until end of turn you may play that card. So play that card means that you can play lands off of this, which is super relevant. That's always the first thing you should check with these sorts of exile effects. But if your opponent lost life at the beginning of your second main phase, which does include attacking them and dealing damage, there are also cards that can like ping your opponent directly for some damage. And so this card just can be a card advantage machine. You often are only going to want to attack with this if it's like a free attack. If you're going to be trading it, you probably won't want to do it because this is a really good way to get a recurring source of card advantage on your opponent. It's going to make your opponent really have to kill this. And as we said, 2-drops are really important. So I think this card is really, really nice. I do think the stat line's a little bit weak. It's a terrible blocker as a 2/1, like just not great stats on that front. So you really want to make sure your deck is aggressive for this card, but luckily that's what red-black is trying to do. So I think this card is solid. Definitely like a good card to be taking for your red-black decks, but I don't think I would really like try to like take this card like first out of a pack because it's not like crazy like insane. It's going to feel really good in the situations where it's good, but if you like fall behind, then your deck is going to suffer a little bit, and you're going to want to also make sure that you have ways to like deal damage to your opponent without attacking if you have this card, because that's going to be a really nice way to ensure that you can get the card advantage in a board stall, which is often when you need the card advantage the most. Definitely a great card though, and one you'll be happy to play in your red-black decks. Moving on to the commons, now that we've covered kind of the context of the set, we kind of know what the decks are trying to do. I want to briefly touch on this hybrid mana, because there is a cycle of like cards that have this hybrid mana symbol. As you see in the upper right of Pond Prophet, it can be cast for blue mana or green mana, or any combination of the two. So 2 green, 2 blue, or blue and a green. And a card like Pond Prophet, I wanted to talk about it specifically. It's at its best on turn 2. Now you can play this in like your blue-white deck, say, if you really wanted to, like you really want to, but oftentimes you aren't going to want to do that because in your blue-white deck, you're not going to be able to consistently cast this on turn 2. In your green-blue deck, you're always going to be able to cast this on turn 2 because you're always going to have some combination of blue and green mana on turn 2. So with this sort of early game play where you really just want to play this as an early game play to set up your other synergies, just imagine this card with the blue-green gold uncommon we just looked at, where you can spend 3 mana to exile it and bring it back into play, draw cards over and over and over. This is a really good card for that deck that cares about enters the battlefield effects. it would be a good card in other decks, but they can't cast it as consistently. So I don't think it's really it doesn't get the flexibility that Hybrid Mana provides to the same degree, which is why I wanted to talk about this card specifically in contrast to a card like Head of the Homestead. So this is another card, and this one is 5 mana, green white hybrid mana, which means that you can cast this for green mana or white mana, or like some combination of both. So you're definitely going to be happy to have this in your green-white decks. Just imagine playing this with the 2-drop green rabbit we already looked at. So you have the green rabbit in place, so it's already a 1/1, and then you play this, make 3 more bodies. All of a sudden, your green rabbit 2-drop that has like star power toughness is a 4/4 with trample. So you're really happy to have Head of the Homestead in your green-white decks that care about a lot of creatures. However, if you look at Head of the Homestead, you might also be thinking, well, this card also plays really well with the like green-blue gold uncommon, because you can exile this and bring it back into play, and every time it enters, you create 2 more rabbits. So that's a really nice synergy piece. 3 mana, make 2 rabbits every turn. Definitely something you'll want to keep in mind. And this card, because it's a 5-drop, having double green by turn 5 is much more likely. So this card actually does get to benefit from Hybrid Mana, because Hybrid Mana is incredibly flexible. If I take Head of the Homestead early in the draft, I get to play this in any green deck or any white deck that I'm playing, which is just twice as flexible as a lot of the, almost twice as flexible, I guess, because green-white is its own color combination. But like, it's significantly more flexible than a simple green card. Whereas if we think about Pond Prophet, you really only want to play that in blue-green. This card is much more flexible as a green card or a white card. Double pipped does mean a little bit, but it's a 5-drop, so you're often going to have, even like if you're playing 9/8, you're going to often have double of both of your colors by that point in the game. And this card can definitely find a home in decks that aren't just specifically green-white, which is why I wanted to highlight it. And the final card with this Hybrid Mana that I wanted to talk about is Seed Pod Squire. With a single Hybrid Mana, you're almost always going to be able to cast this in your blue decks or your white decks by the time you get to 4 mana. So when you have this sort of Hybrid Mana, just think about, okay, this card is actually significantly more flexible. It's going to fit into any blue deck, any white deck, and really shine. The other cool thing about this card is when it attacks, target creature you control without flying gets +1/+1 until end of turn, which not only plays well with the bird theme of this set, but also plays really well with those red-white cards. So if you imagine playing that red-white mouse that we had, all of a sudden you have your Seed Pod Squire, you attack with your Squire, you target the mouse, it gets a +1/+1 counter from what we've seen before, or whatever other Valiant ability you have, because it's a creature without flying. So that's the sort of synergy you should be keeping an eye out for. This may be blue-white hybrid mana, but it can fit definitely well into a red-white deck, or really just like keep an eye out for the decks where they are going to really shine. So you want to make sure you maximize your cards, and taking flexible cards early, especially the hybrid mana ones that can maybe fit into multiple strategies pretty well, is worth noting. There is fun final note on the flexibility aspect is that there's a cycle of 10 cards with this duo title in the name, and there are double creature types. So Baker's Bane Duo is one of my favorites. It's 1 and a green for a 2/2 squirrel raccoon. So it fits ideally into a squirrel deck, which is the green-black deck, or a raccoon deck, which is the red-green deck. And as you can see, when it enters, it creates a food token, and when you expend 4, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So the black-green deck cares about food tokens, the green-red deck cares about expending. And I think this card is just a really nice card, even just in any green deck. It also plays well in the Enters the Battlefield deck, because if you can trigger this Enters the Battlefield a bunch of times, you get some extra foods. And overall, just a 2/2 that comes with a food is just a really nice card. I think this card is very, very strong, likely to be a very high pick for any deck, because it just like does exactly what you want in pretty much every single strategy. And expend and food tokens are kind of just generically good, even if you don't have any extra synergy. So just keep an eye out for these duo cards, because they can be nice little flex points early in the draft that fit well into multiple strategies, because they have been kind of designed as these glue pieces that are kind of good with multiple synergies. We're going to move through some of the commons that I think are of interest to evaluate, and maybe a bit trickier, as well as that have beneficial lessons as well now. So Sonar Strike is one of the best versions of this effect we've ever seen. 2 mana. Normally these like deal damage to attacking or blocking creatures effects aren't that good, because they are so like inflexible. They can only hit things that are attacking or blocking. They have like those timing restrictions, but this also can hit tapped creatures, which is a really nice little bit of upside to have, where if you top deck this in the mid game, you can actually kill your opponent's creature that has been attacking you without waiting for it to attack you again, and then be vulnerable to like combat tricks or things like that once your opponent's untapped. And also if you have a bat, you get to gain 3 life, which, as we've seen, black-white bats can really care about just having life gain in general. Gaining 3 life is a significant upside, and also just can trigger your other effects that care about this. So I think this card is actually going to be pretty solid if you're a deck, especially that cares about like being more mid-rangey or defensive. Aggressive decks tend not to value this sort of card as highly, because when you're an aggressive deck, you really want to kill your opponent's blocker and then attack them so that they can't like soak up any damage, and they don't care about life gain themselves. So if I'm playing a red-white mouse aggressive deck, and I attack my opponent with all my creatures, and they block and I use Sonar Strike, all of a sudden they've like absorbed like maybe 3 damage from the 3/3 that they blocked or something like that. Whereas if I'm playing a bat control deck, my opponent attacks me, I kill their attacker, gain 3 life. All of a sudden, my opponent is in a world of pain because I presumably have late game card advantage to take over the game, and all I need to do is stabilize. And I've just done that by gaining 3 life and killing one of their attackers. Additionally, if you're an aggressive deck, your opponent's creatures aren't naturally going to be tapped as much because they're going to be staying back to block, which means that you're going to have to like rely on your opponent's like on other effects to like tap your opponent's creatures or maybe like kill them when they're blocking, which is still definitely a thing you can do, but it's just a little bit weaker in aggressive decks. It is worth noting that if you're playing like a control mirror match where nobody's attacking that much or attacking isn't that relevant to the outcome of the game, this isn't the sort of card you always have to keep in your deck. You can definitely sideboard it out. But yeah, just one of the best versions of this effect we've seen, but just those caveats on where you want to play it, because people see cards and they think, oh, it's good or it's bad. But a lot of cards are really good in one home and then solid elsewhere, or kind of even poor elsewhere, and it's important to know that and evaluate cards accordingly. Next is Thistledown Players. Not going to talk about this card too much, but 3 mana for a 3/3, already decent stats. This is a sort of like filler level card, but its ability is really interesting when it attacks untap target non-land permanent. And I think a lot of the times it's like you can read this and just be like, well, it attacks and it can untap itself, so it's kind of like a vigilance creature. But in the context of this set specifically, anything that says target non-land permanent can target one of your Valiant creatures, and this does fit into the red-white Valiant mouse deck. And so I just think it's important to, when you see the ability to target something, just view this as a little bit of an extra synergy piece for that Valiant deck, because you can target your Valiant creatures and get those effects. So just keep that in mind with any card that says target. Definitely not a card you prioritize. I think you'll just be able to pick these up whenever you want them pretty much in the draft, but definitely a card that's more playable than it looks probably, because just being able to trigger your cards is really nice. Next up is Finch Formation. This card's really interesting, and it does highlight one of the new mechanics of the set, which is Offspring, which lets you pay extra mana for a 1/1 copy of that creature. So this is a 3 mana 2/2 flyer, which inherently is a bit behind the curve these days. It used to be that you would like pay a 1 mana premium for flying, so like a 2 mana 2/2 creature on the ground is solid, and a 3 mana 2/2 flyer is solid. This is a little bit behind the curve these days. You generally want to have like a nice little ability, like sometimes a 3 mana 2/2 flyer will have prowess or something like that. So Finch Formation does need a bit of a help. Being able to give a creature flying until end of turn is nice. Remember, this does say target, so you can trigger Valiant abilities with this if you have some like white creatures with Valiant. But generally, it's like it's going to be a solid like way to like jump one of your creatures if you're trying to attack them. But 3 mana 2/2 is pretty bad stat lines for defending, and the Offspring ability is so expensive that other than as like a late game way to like jump 2 of your creatures into the sky and attack your opponent for a huge swing, I don't see this card being like a crazy high pick, though it is definitely the sort of card that you can play. It just feels like it gets lost a little bit in the 3-drop soup that we often find yourselves in draft, and definitely like an okay card, but not one that like maybe is as good as one would expect with a card with like this much text and things like that. Next is Mind Spiral. This is a really interesting card. It does highlight another mechanic from the set, which is the gift mechanic, which I think is going to be a very skill testing aspect of the format. So when you cast this, you can gift a tapped fish, which means you give your opponent a 1/1 fish creature token that is tapped before you resolve the effects of the spell. Target player draws 3 cards, so that's you. You'll draw 3, and then if the gift was promised, then you can tap a creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. Now, the interesting thing about this sort of card is that generally I think that giving your opponent a gift isn't that advisable. The downside of giving your opponent anything in exchange for one of your like and a little bit of an extra effect on your cards is generally like not the best, because you give your opponent something like valuable themselves to maybe help them come back or give them a little bit of an extra resource. In this exact context, a 1/1 might not seem like much, but if you can help it, you prefer not to give your opponent a 1/1. The reason I think it's like kind of a cool ability on this specific card is oftentimes the problem with expensive sorcery speed card draw is you kind of spend your entire turn getting card advantage and not affecting the board state, whereas this does help you a little bit neutralize your opponent's biggest threat for a turn at least. And just like gives you a little bit of a breather to use the extra cards you've drawn. But still, generally, I would advise against like putting like a large number of these effects in your deck. Sorcery speed card draw is just that's expensive, especially, and kind of takes your whole turn. Often is going to be like put you behind when you really need to be able to like pull ahead, like, or be able to like stabilize or like play a big blocker. So like your opponent's like beating you down and you just have this card in your hand and you can't really cast it. And in Magic the Gathering, if you have cards in your hand that you can't really cast, it's really, really bad if there's situations where that happens. And sorcery speed card draw is one of the biggest examples of this. If you have a big creature, you can always put it into play. It attacks well, it blocks well, it kind of does its thing. Sorcery speed card draw, if the game is stalled or you're in a late game situation, or like if you're a little bit ahead, it can be good. But generally, like if you're ahead, you want more creatures. If you're behind, you want more creatures. Or removal spells or things like that. So definitely the sort of card that's like a bit more niche, not a high priority, but I think the ability of gift on this card is really interesting. And I would advise against giving your opponent a gift in all but the most extreme circumstances, unless you really, really need it to like help you survive an extra turn. Next is Dire Sight, just another example of this kind of sorcery speed card draw effect. And I just want to highlight this again as like losing life can be a really big downside, but if you have cards that care about you losing life, this can actually be worth playing, I think. This card is very reminiscent of a previous card, Read the Bones, which was like a staple card that was like pretty solid card advantage for a long time, because Surveilling 2 is almost like drawing a card in the late game, because lands are pretty irrelevant. And if you have a deck that cares about Threshold, like the blue-black deck we looked at earlier, being able to put like 2 cards and then the Dire Sight itself into your graveyard can get you a decent chunk of the way towards Threshold. But losing 2 life on your card draw just means that like when you're on the draw and your opponent goes like 2-drop, attack, and then you play maybe a 2-drop, and then they play a 3-drop creature, and you just play this on the draw, losing 2 life just puts you under a lot of pressure, and so I'm hesitant to include these cards too highly, even though this effect can be quite useful in the right matchup and in the right deck that cares about filling its graveyard. So just be careful with this sort of card. The next card, though, that can lose you life is a card that I'm a big fan of. 3 mana, be able to destroy target creature, and then if you give your opponent a food token, then you don't have to lose the 2 life. This is really nice because a lot of the times the kill spells we see are like 1 black, and the difference between 2 and a black and 1 black is actually incredibly significant. It drastically increases your ability to cast this card on turn 3, makes it far more flexible, makes it the sort of card that you can like splash in your sealed decks. And giving your opponent a food isn't really ideal because you'd prefer not to give your opponent a food, especially if they're a deck that has like forage cards that can use the food. But generally speaking, you're going to be pretty happy to have like the ability to kill whatever you want at instant speed. It sets you up to blow out your opponents if they have like pump spells or things that are like auras or things like that. And so I think this card is really, really good and definitely a high priority and a card that just fits nicely into every deck. You're going to be happy to have this in any of your black decks. It's going to really do what you want it to do, and it doesn't have that much of a downside giving your opponent a food. I would say giving your opponent a food is much less bad than giving your opponent a creature or a card. There are gift cards that give your opponents cards, which means they let your opponent draw, or like 1/1 fish tokens. I think giving your opponent a food is the least of those 3 outcomes because the food token can't like save a losing game for them unless it's enabling a forage ability. So be careful about doing this against the forage decks. Luckily, forage is like a very mid-rangey ability, so against those decks, oftentimes you'll be able to just like take two damage because your opponent maybe isn't pressuring you as much. But just keep that in mind. The green and the black decks with forage cards are going to care about food a little bit more. But if you're playing like against a blue-black control deck, you don't care about losing 2 life a lot of the time. But yeah, Nocturnal Hunger, a really nice card to have access to, and definitely like a really premium common. Next is Glide Dive Duo. I just wanted to briefly touch on this because it looks like very lackluster as a 5 mana 3/3, so the stats aren't insane. And then it's like doesn't have that much text on it, but having each opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life is actually really good. We've seen this exact sort of card before. It was quite some time ago in Guilds of Ravnica. It was a 5 mana 3/3 flyer with this exact ability. They lose 2 life, you gain 2 life, and it was one of the best commons in this set because that's just a really, really powerful immediate impact you have on the game. This is even better here because there are decks, as we already saw, that care about you gaining life, like the Bats deck, or your opponent losing life, like the Lizards deck. This is one of those duo creatures that we already talked about that kind of fit well into multiple strategies, and this kind of fits well into that white-black deck or that red-black deck. And also, it's just like a nice, solid top-end card with a reasonable ability to help you stabilize in really any black deck. So this is just a nice, rock-solid card that you should be aware of. It's probably better than it looks, just because maybe it doesn't look that good to you, but it's definitely a solid card and pretty nice to have. Next is Might of the Meek. This is a card that I think is reasonable, and the reason I wanted to talk about it is because I think the play pattern with this card is a bit different from most conventional combat tricks. This one says that a creature gains +1/+0 until end of turn if you control a mouse and gains trample, and then you also get to draw a card. And generally, I think these sorts of the cards are the ones you're like, oh, I'll attack all my creatures, my opponent will block my 2/3 with their 3/3, I'll buff my creature's power, and I'll be able to trade, and everything will be good. I think a lot of the time in this set, you're going to want to like pick your spots where your opponent's tapped out and then use this when your opponent can't have interaction spells to trigger your Valiant cards. I think that's going to probably be the best use of this card as like a cheap way to trigger Valiant and just like move on. You draw the card, you get a little bit of a power buff. But I think it's easy to think, oh, I'm going to go for value with this to try and like trade up in combat when a lot of the time you should instead be thinking, how can I use this with Valiant cards to get a little bit more out of this while my opponent doesn't have mana up? And so I think that's just a good, important reframe with this card. Not a high pick by any means, but if you're in some like deck that cares about Valiant, then you can play it. And also if you're in a blue-red spells deck with those Otter Spells Matter cards, sometimes you might want to just play this card even if you don't have a lot of mice, because you can just like cast a spell for 1 mana, and that can be like really, really beneficial if you like have cards that care about casting a non-creature spell like instants and sorceries or things like that. Next is Elenia's Pathmaker. This is just another card. Brief note here, 4 mana 4/2, reasonable stats, not great. Like you wouldn't play a 4 mana 4/2, but with its ability, it's really like totally solid. You exile the top card of your library, and then until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. Now, I already talked about how it's important to look with these cards and say, does it say play that card or cast that card? Play that card means you can play lands with this, which is huge upside. Just almost always going to get you a card that you can play, because you're going to have like, you already have 4 mana when you play this, and so the next turn you're probably going to have 5 mana, so you can play anything that costs 5 or less. Now, until the end of your next turn is really awesome as well, which means you'll have the entire next turn to plan around playing that card. This thing plays well with cards that like do their thing. It doesn't play great with combat tricks, because you can't really use a combat trick once it's face up like that. But if you just have like a lot of creatures in your deck, a lot of like aura, not auras even, because your opponent can blow you out if you have auras, but like things that are just like rock solid, do what they do, like removal spells and creatures are like the most common examples of things that just do what they do, and this card seems like it's going to be solid as a result. 4 mana is a lot. You generally want to have like, you don't need to prioritize 4-drops as heavily, but this is just a solid card to take in the middle of a pack and be pretty happy playing in pretty much any red deck. Next is Cash Grab. This is a really cool card in green. It's an instant. It mills 4 cards, so already kind of fills your graveyard for those threshold cards. Even though that is more of a blue-black thing, it is still relevant to fill your graveyard. And importantly, in black-green, filling your graveyard helps you with Forage, because you can remove 3 cards in your graveyard and put them in exile. So this card really helps you get a lot of progress for foraging. You can put a permanent card from one of the cards milled into your hand, and if you control a squirrel or return a squirrel your hand, you create a food token. So if you mill 4 cards, get back a squirrel or have a squirrel in play, you get to like fill your graveyard with essentially 4 cards, because Cash Grab plus 3 cards, because one of the 4 cards you mill is going to your hand. All of a sudden, 4 more cards in your graveyard and a food token. That's pretty much 2 forages. So if you have a lot of cards that care about forage in your deck, then Cash Grab is going to be really, really what you're looking for. And if you don't have that, then I don't think this is a card you want. This is one of those secret gold cards a lot of the time that people will talk about. Secret gold card means it's really a card you only want in black-green, which means it's not really an early pick in the draft. Once you know you're in black-green, I feel like you'll be quite happy to have this card, because it helps you find your best permanents, and it also gets you a lot of like cardboard, like essentially like it gets you food tokens and like things in your graveyard, like material that you can use for your forage, which is something that's valuable as well. But it's like a secret gold card, because you don't really want it in your blue-green decks, you don't really want it in your red-green decks, you don't really want it in your white-green decks. You just kind of only want it in black-green. And so as a result, it's not really a high priority, but once you're in black-green, you can maybe get some of these late because other green decks don't want them, and you'll actually be quite happy having it, I think, because you get to really benefit with your forage cards and also just find your best squirrels, which is a nice upside as well. Next is Polywallop, which is a card that I wanted to talk about because I think it's a little bit worse than maybe it looks on first read. A lot of the times, it's easy to compare green removal spells to green removal spells of the past, where it's like, oh, for 1 mana, we used to have fight effects. And for 2 mana, we used to have bite effects, which are cards that have your creatures deal damage to your opponent's creatures. And this is 4 mana for that sort of effect. It's at instant speed, which is definitely relevant. Instant speed makes it less likely you're going to get blown out. And it can cost less if you have frogs. But generally, and like dealing damage equal to twice its power means you're often going to be able to kill what you care about. But the thing is this card is a good card, don't get me wrong, but it's easy to think about comparing this to other green punch spells instead of just thinking about it compared to like the black removal spell we looked at earlier, which is like 3 mana, instant speed, no questions asked, kill anything. And this is like 4 mana, sometimes not kill what you want, sometimes do kill what you want, and you have to have a creature in play, and it does expose you to 2-for-1 potential. Now, I'm not saying compare every single removal spell to that 3 mana black removal spell we looked at, because that's one of the better removal spells in the set. It's a really, really good card. But you have to like think about, oh, instead of thinking just, oh, this card is good for what green gets, maybe, or good compared to previous green effects, or good to historically green effects, just think about it in terms of like, okay, this is a pretty expensive removal spell, and I don't necessarily want to have this be like what I'm up to. That being said, it plays well with frogs, which is nice, because if you're in like a blue-green frogs deck and you have 2 frogs in play, doing this for 2 mana is quite good. And also it plays decently in the red-green deck because it is 4 mana at instant speed, so you can actually expend on your opponent's turn for the cards that care about that. So keep that in mind as well, that if you are going to be expending, If you care about expending at least, then spending 4 mana for a spell at instant speed isn't the end of the world. But just keep in mind, 4 mana for this sort of effect is quite a lot, and you don't want to get blown out by your opponent having a kill spell in response. Next is Longstock Brawl. This is another gift card, and I just wanted to talk about it briefly because I think generally it's tempting to just use the gift when you have the ability to, like, oh, I'll put a counter on my guy, fight your guy. All of a sudden, my guy's big. I think generally you only want to use the gift ability if you can't win the fight otherwise, or if you have some other strategic reason for doing so, like, oh, my opponent has a lot of 3 damage burn effects, burn spells, and I want to like get my 3/3 out of range or something like that. I think a lot of the time giving your opponent the 1/1 is just going to be extra downside if your opponent then has a kill spell. So like imagine you have a 3/3 and your opponent has a 2/2, and you give your opponent a gift for no cause, and instead of just fighting them normally, and then the next turn your opponent kills your 4/4. All of a sudden they're left with that 1/1 fish, and then they have a tangible board advantage, whereas before you would just had a 3/3 against an empty board, and a 3/3 against an empty board is just generally going to be better than a 4/4 against a 1/1, because your opponent can still do the same blocks they would have before, because they can like chip in with a double block or things like that. Like if they still have a 3/3, it can still like double block and force the trade, barring combat tricks, which was already the case. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, that generally you want to avoid giving your opponent the fish, or just avoid giving your opponent the gift if it's going to be like worth a card or worth a tangible advantage, because you don't want to have your opponent like be able to kill your creature and then get a benefit. Now, if this was give opponent a food token, which it's not, I know it's hypothetical, and I hope not to confuse people by saying this, but if you, just as an example, like a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures is a more tangible advantage than a food token for your opponent, generally speaking, unless they have forage cards, but just in like general, a +1/+1 counter on your creature is going to be worth more in like a board state battle, because like all of a sudden your creature has extra power and toughness, which is really, really nice. So that's generally going to be better. So if it was like a food token, then that would be like definitely something that you're probably interested in. But if it's like a card, then all of a sudden you're like never want to do that, because giving your opponent an extra card is like really, really bad. And then the fish token is somewhere in between, where you can sometimes use this to like give your opponent a little bit of a benefit, but you get to kill one of their creatures, so you get to keep something slightly bigger. But generally speaking, try to avoid giving your opponent gifts. I'd have a couple of uncommons that I want to talk about as well, because they might be a little bit more confusing, but not too many uncommons, because I do want to make sure that I talk about just the most interesting cards and help you learn how to evaluate these cards yourself as well. Into the Floodmaw is a interesting effect. Again, it has this gift, a tapped fish, which you really want to avoid. This is a 1-mana return a creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand, and then if the gift was promised, you return a non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So any non-land instead of just a creature. Now the problem with this card is that 1-mana blue bounce spells are oftentimes able to target any creature, which includes your own creatures, and that buffs up their power significantly, which means that you can save your creatures from removal. You can do, that's like a pretty big reason to want to do it. You can bounce your own creature if you like have a good enters the battlefield effect, which isn't the most common cost. Mostly it's just nice to be able to save your creature from removal spells. Like your opponent goes for a kill spell on your important creature, you bounce it to your hand, all of a sudden you can play it again. And not being able to do that makes Into the Floodmaw a card that I'm not excited to play. 1 mana, just bounce your opponent's creature. It puts you down on cards. You pretty much never want to give them a fish. And this is a card that I would generally not take very highly. And I would maybe sometimes play, like if I'm a deck that like really just wants to like maybe get to the late game, like I have a lot of card advantage and I'm like willing to like throw away a card, because this is throwing away a card because your opponent can eventually just replay that creature. But if I'm willing to like throw away a card in order to get like a little bit of temporary board presence, I can. But generally speaking, this isn't a card that I'm going to prioritize or play even very often. Like I can definitely see leaving this on the sidelines a lot of the time. Next is Coruscation Mage, or Coruscation Mage. It's a really good card. It's 2 mana for a 2/2, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. It also has Offspring, so if you spend 4 mana, you get twice of this effect, but one of them's a 1/1. That's just absolutely fantastic. This card is incredible. We've seen cards like this in the past that like require like they tap to deal damage to your opponent, and then they untap when you cast a non-creature spell, and so then you can like ping your opponent a bunch of times that way. But just dealing 1 damage to your opponent, we've also seen like this as a 2/1 or things like that. And these cards are really, really good. And one of the best things about them is that they scale well in multiples. And so this card is just fantastic in your blue-red decks, because you just have, say, let's just say 13 spells or non-creature spells, and all of a sudden you just like play this on turn 4. You get, every time you cast a non-creature spell, deal 2 to your opponent. I mean, this is the best version of this effect ever we've ever seen, I think, at common or uncommon especially, and it just looks really, really good. And it also plays well in the black-red Lizards deck that cares about dealing damage to your opponent, because this can definitely be a way to deal damage to your opponent, especially in a board stall situation. So just a really, really good card, and definitely one to keep an eye out for and definitely take highly. I think it's fantastic. A little bit more simply, we see Quake Tuskabor as a 5 mana 5/5 reach trample haste. Now, this is a like homage almost to Charging Monstrosaur, which was a card from Ixalan. It was pretty much the like scariest card in that set. It was an uncommon, but it was like absolutely terrifying. 5 mana, 5/5 trample haste. It didn't have the reach, but this card just comes down and hits like a truck, like immediately. Your opponent like can't necessarily prepare for this. They can't really have like a good double block lined up at all times. They're not always just going to have their 4/4 and their 2/2 chilling back on blocks, especially if you don't have like a huge board state. They'll just attack you with one of their creatures, and then all of a sudden you just get to charge in for 5 damage, deal a massive chunk of their life total, and then present a huge problem for the next turn. It's just a really, really good curve topper for your aggressive decks and a card you'll definitely want to prioritize. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that these cards are like, oh, it's got only like normal keywords. It doesn't have a bunch of text on it, so therefore it's not as good as the fancier cards. This card is really, really strong and definitely worth prioritizing. It also just fits well into red decks. Like, you just like this card, and like it doesn't have like the creature types or like the fancy like synergy pieces with the red decks, but just like you care about this in your red white mouse deck because like you're beating your opponent down with a bunch of little mice that have like valiant abilities, and then all of a sudden you just like boom, drop this card in play and just hit them for a bunch of damage. It's just really good for those sorts of things. Next is Bushy Bodyguard, another one of those cards that I read it, did a double take, and like exclaimed out loud just when I was reading it. Luckily, I was not out and about when I was reading this card because people would have been confused, but this card is absolutely stellar. 2 mana for a 2/1, not great stats, but when it enters, you can forage, and as I've been saying with forage, to forage, exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food, and so that's how foraging works. And with Bushy Bodyguard, if you forage, you put 2+1/+1 counters on it. So if you have forage enabled, you can get a 2 mana 4/3. But that's not all, because it has offspring for 2 mana, which means you can pay an additional 2 to get an additional 1/1 copy of the Bodyguard, which will also enter with that same forage ability. So if you have 2 foods in play, or 1 food and a full graveyard, or a fully stocked graveyard, you can spend 4 mana to get a 4/3 and a 3/3. Which is just so much stats for 4 mana. Now, you might not be able to do that exactly on turn 4, but whenever you do it, it's going to be so much stats for 1 card. And the crazy thing about this card that I've been thinking about is how well it plays in like multiple different decks. Like obviously in black-green, when you have foods and fill your graveyard, it's really, really nice. But it's also nice in the like blue-green deck where you can like have it leave play and come back into play as like a 4/3 if you play it as a 2-drop, as like a 2/1 earlier. So like you played as a 2/1 early, you exile it, it comes back as a 4/3 in the late game once you can enable it. That's like something that you can do with this card. You can also spend it in the red-green deck to like spend 4 mana, but where it really shines is in that black-green deck, as we already discussed. And I think one of the things that's really nice about this card is the way it plays with that green common that we looked at earlier, the one that mills you for 4 cards and then can bring back a squirrel into play. Like you mill yourself for 4 cards, bring this Bushy Bodyguard back into your hand, you get a food token because you already you returned a squirrel to your hand, and you already have the fodder in your graveyard to forage. So all of a sudden, you play that 2-drop, you get your Bushy Bodyguard, and then you can just play the Bodyguard, and you have the you can just fully enable the offspring and the main Bushy Bodyguard's foraging. So this is just so much stats for 4 mana that it's just like absolutely insane card, really, really high priority, and just a great card that would definitely make me want to play black-green if I had it, and make me want to really prioritize that 2 mana common that we already looked at, the one that lets you dig 4 cards to look for squirrels and permanents and things like that. The final card we're going to talk about is Lilypad Village. There's a cycle of these cards, but I just want to touch on this one briefly and as kind of a placeholder for all 5 of them. There's one for each color. They can tap for colorless or tap for a color to spend only to cast creature spells. This one is the blue one. And then in the late game, it has the ability to tap, or just anytime you want it, but usually you'll use this in the late game. You can spend a blue and tap it to surveil 2, activate only if a bird, frog, otter, or rat enters the battlefield under your control this turn. And utility lands like this are really, really nice to have. These ones are a little bit more narrow because you can only spend their colored mana to cast creature spells, but it's definitely still well worth including if you are planning on like playing these colors and have those creature types, which you are going to generally have if you have those colors. So just keep this sort of thing in mind. It's a really nice thing to have access to in the late game to help you just get a little bit of extra value from your lands, because if you're flooding out and you like maybe just draw like 1 bird, all of a sudden it can just chain you into more birds once you have like 7 lands in play. Things like that can really just make a difference. So this card seems like really nice. Definitely a card that I would take once I knew I was in like a blue deck. I wouldn't like take it too early and be like, okay, I'm going to play blue because I have this card. It's more of a, okay, I'm in blue. This is a really good card to take and prioritize. That's kind of how I view it. Anyway, that's going to do it for the cards I'm talking about. If you want to see my thoughts on every card in the set, I will have a full tier list for this set, which you can find on the NicolaiBolas Patreon. So if you become a patron at any of the paying levels, it really helps out the channel, and it also will gain you access to my full draft grades for every card in Bloomburrow. So if you've liked my perspective on this and you'd like to see my kind of A through F rating on all of the cards, this is a nice resource that you have available to you if that's something you're interested in. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. Leave hashtag BloomThinking in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.